So we're going to look at the silicate minerals. They are important because they form a lot of rocks at Earth's surface. They are silicates in that they contain this motif called the Silica Tetrahedron, SiO4 4-. That Silica Tetrahedron looks a lot like this. So we've got silicon and silver in there in the middle, and then 4 oxygens at the 4 corners of a tetrahedron. In this view, you should be able to see a little bit better why we call it a tetrahedron. It is 4 sides, 1, 2, 3, and then 4th is on the bottom. So it's got 4 sides. It's a triangular pyramid here. And these are the 8 silicate minerals we're going to look at in this course that we're going to need to be able to identify. So we've got Olivine, Augite, Hornblende, Biotite, Muscovite, Plagioclase, Feldspar, Orthoclase, Feldspar, and last but not least, Quartz. Here's Olivine. It is usually green to greenish black in color. Has a non-metallic luster, so it kind of looks vitreous or glassy if you take a good look at pieces of it, but it doesn't shine like a metal does. It's a pretty hard mineral. It'll scratch glass, and it'll scratch a lot of the other minerals that we're looking at. Take a look there, created a scratch on this glass plate, meaning that it's pretty hard. It doesn't have any obvious cleavage planes. It tends to instead have fracture or look like sort of aggregates of small crystals. Here's the internal structure of Olivine. So it is a silicate, so it's got the silicate tetrahedra like we were talking about. It's also got some magnesium in it, Mg2+, that's in green. And we can see that the tetrahedra in Olivine, if you rotate this around, none of them are connected to one another. So these are isolated tetrahedra. As a result, those tetrahedra have a lot of negative charge. They need a lot of these positive magnesium 2+ ions to balance out that charge. So that's why there's so much magnesium in the Olivine structure. Here's Augite. It's got a greenish black color and it's non-metallic. It's got a vitreous luster, which means once again that it's kind of like a pane of glass if you pick it up and can catch the reflections with it. We'll see if we can under this. Not super well, but if you had a hand sample of it, you'd be able to tell it a little better. It's got 2 cleavages at 90 degrees that are pretty difficult to see in a hand sample. You can maybe convince yourself if you turn it on its side that some of these faces meet at 90 degrees, but it's awfully tough to see in this sample. In this zoomed in look at a cleavage face of Augite, you can see some of these breaks on the surface meet at roughly 90 degrees. So there you can see those cleavage planes meeting at 90 degrees. In this polarized microscope image, where you see a bunch of different minerals, of different grains of minerals in this view, this one in the very center is a piece of pyroxene, and you can just make out that those cleavage planes are meeting at 90 degrees at right angles to one another. It's also a hard mineral. Its hardness is 6, so it's harder than glass. So that means if we scratch it on a glass plate, we'll see it scratches it just a little bit. It's tough to do. But if you try to compare your Augite to a piece of quartz, you'll be able to see that the quartz is going to scratch the Augite because quartz has a hardness of 7, Augite of 6. Here's the 3D structure of Augite. We can see those silicate tetrahedra are in there just like they were with Olivine, just like they are with all the silicate minerals. But on this one, we can see that those silicate tetrahedra are connected to one another. They're linked, at least at some of the corners. And as we move this around, we start to get the sense that they're connected in what we call chains, because it's just one linear arrangement that are all connected to one another. If we turn and we look down the axis, we can see each of these chains is separated from each other one. But going into the plane of the view, those are silicate tetrahedra are all connected to one another. So we call this chain-linked tetrahedra. You can also get a sense looking from the side that those are chains, or from the top, looking down, you get the sense that those are chains. And all those green atoms in there are things that aren't silicon or oxygen. So it includes a lot of magnesium and sometimes iron, and it can have sodium and calcium and a bunch of other things substituted in there a little bit too. Another word you might hear associated with Augite is the word pyroxene. So in addition to being a silicate, we can further subdivide that class of minerals into a bunch more. One of those classes is pyroxenes. They're the types of minerals that have those single chains that we just looked at in the structure. So Augite, because it has a single chain structure, is a type of pyroxene. You might see both words. Hornblende is our next silicate mineral. Looks pretty similar to augite, right? It's black, so it's pretty dark in color, and it looks sort of prismatic oftentimes. It has two cleavages, just like augite does, but we'll talk about why that's different. It's also pretty hard, so scratch the glass if I did this scratch test on that one more time. And it has a non-metallic vitreous luster. So how can we distinguish it from augite? Well, if we get a really good sample, we'll note that it has two cleavages that meet at 60 and 120 degrees. So it makes these diamond shapes, in contrast with augite, which tends to make more of a square shape if you can get a good look at a microscopic piece of it, especially. Here's a good view of a microscopic piece of hornblende, where you can see the fracture pattern either on the left, where it's not in color because it's plain polarized light, or in this crossed polarized light over here that imparts it sort of a brownish color. We can see that the fractures meet at 60 and 120 degrees. They don't meet at right angles. They meet and sort of make these diamond-shaped cleavage planes in here that we can see there, or we can see over here in this image if we want to look at that. So you can see, helps to have a microscopic image of it, but that augite would be 90 degrees and hornblende would be 60 and 120 degrees. It's one main way to tell them apart. Another way that we might be able to use in some of these hand samples is that if you look at the sides of hornblende, they tend to have this sort of shattered looking appearance to them, where it looks like lots of small little crystals, little prismatic, so elongated in one direction crystals that meet together. And so you can see that a little bit on this face in this camera view. Here I've switched back to augite, and you can see it doesn't have that elongated, shattered look to it. Here you see the structure of hornblende, looking at it end on again, and it looks pretty similar to augite, where I've colored, once again, the silicon in gray, the oxygen, linking those tetrahedra in red, and then everything else that's in there, sodium, calcium, magnesium, and iron, colored all those in green. And you can see that looks like the tetrahedra are linked to one another, but unlike in augite, these are actually linked in double chains, excuse me. So that instead of being just one chain wide, where it's one tetrahedra wide in each direction, you can imagine taking each one of those single chains and connecting it to another chain alongside it. So we call it a double chain silicate because of that. Similar to augite, but the chains are extra wide in hornblende, and that actually is what ends up making it so that those cleavage planes meet at 60 to 120 degrees. So much like augite was a type of pyroxene, we say that the mineral hornblende that we've got here is a type of amphibole. Amphiboles being the class of silicate minerals that have those double wide chains in it. Sometimes you need stupid little mnemonics to remember some of these things. So here's how I remember the difference between pyroxenes and amphiboles. You write out the word pyroxene, that capital P has one dangling line in it. And the word amphibole, you draw it with a capital A, it's got those two dangling lines on the letter A. Pyroxene is the shingle chains, 1 point. Amphibole is the double chains, 2 points. It's dumb, but it helps. Our next silicate mineral is biotite. It's got a dark color, just like all the other ones that we've looked at, but it's special in that it forms these very thin sheets. If I pick up one of these pieces of biotite, it's kind of hard to grab, you can see they're almost thin, like plasticky almost sheets, because they have one cleavage plane and it breaks them flat along that cleavage plane. It's non-metallic, so it's got a vitreous luster, just like the augite and the hornblende and even the olivine. But unlike those, this mineral tends to be soft. Hardness of 2.5 means that you might be able to scratch it with your fingernail, but you'll definitely be able to scratch it with a penny, copper penny. And if you gouge into it there, you can see that scratch that I just created, because biotite is a pretty soft mineral. Here's the crystal structure of the mineral biotite. Silicon in gray, oxygen in red, and everything else in green, just like usual. And if we turn and we rotate this to look at it, we can see that these tetrahedra are connected in a 2D network, a sort of sheet-shaped network. They're only not joined in this third axis, so they're not joined up and down here. If we rotate that 90 degrees and look at it from the top, we can see that the tetrahedra are joined left to right and up to down. So That's why it forms those sheet-shaped pieces, because biotite actually is connected in sheets. We call these sheet silicates as a result. In the class of minerals, silicate minerals known as mica includes biotite. So biotite is a type of mica, and all micas are types of sheet silicates. The mineral muscovite is another type of mica that also forms those same thin sheets. So muscovite, pretty similar to biotite, forms those thin sheets. It's got a non-metallic luster, and it's pretty soft, so we can scratch it with the copper penny. The only difference is the color here. So muscovite has a very light color, and if you've got just small thin pieces of it, it's pretty clear and see-through, so transparent. So what's the difference then between muscovite mica and biotite mica, which are both our sheet silicate minerals? The difference for these, and we'll see this is important later on in the next lab, is that biotite has lots of iron and magnesium in it, which imparts a dark color. And muscovite doesn't have those. It's got other elements in there, maybe some potassium, maybe more aluminum, stuff like that will make muscovite lighter in color than biotite. Here's the view of the muscovite structure. Looks very similar to biotite. You can rotate it, blah, and eventually you get to a view where you can tell that these are connected in sheets, just like biotite is. The only difference is that these other atoms, the green atoms in here, they aren't iron and magnesium. And here they're aluminum and potassium. So biotite is iron and magnesium. Plagioclase is our next silicate mineral that we want to talk about. So here's a piece of plagioclase. It's got a light color. Oftentimes it's going to be white, could be a little bit off-white. You could even tend to gray or some other weirder colors and samples that we're not going to look at. For your purposes, think that plagioclase is the white colored one. It's not pink though. See why that matters in a second. It's got a non-metallic luster, and in this case it is vitreous, which means if you catch the light right, see if we can, not great in this lighting, but if you catch the light right, this flat face here will reflect light all at the same time, just like a pane of glass would. It's got two cleavages at 90 degrees, awfully difficult to see in some of these samples. Maybe you can look down this axis and tell that there's a 90-degree angle there in between two of those flat faces. It's hard to tell though. Instead, if we look at this image here, this is an image of plagioclase, a really well-formed crystal with one flat face and then a second flat face, so two cleavage planes, and they meet at a 90-degree angle. And then this third face over here is rough. It's not actually a cleavage face. It breaks very unevenly along that face. So two cleavages at 90 degrees in plagioclase. In addition to that, plagioclase is a hard mineral, just like most of the other silicates, except for the micas. It's got a hardness of 6, which means that it can scratch the glass plate, but it can't scratch quartz. Quartz will scratch it instead. Here is the crystal structure of plagioclase. So once again, we've got silicon in gray, oxygen in red, and then everything else in green. You'll notice that in comparison to the other minerals that we've looked at, the other silicates, that there's less of the green stuff, less other stuff around. And so the other stuff in here is going to be sodium and calcium. There's just not as much of it as there is other stuff in other minerals that we've looked at. Looking around at how these tetrahedra are connected to one another, you can pick one out that's near the center, say this one near the center of the image here, and count how many tetrahedra it's connected to. So 1, 2, 3, 4. It's connected to 4. So it's got 4 corners, and each corner is connected to a different tetrahedron. That means that we call this a network or a framework silicate because all the tetrahedra are connected to one another. There's no separate chains or sheets in this structure. They're not isolated. They're all bonded together. And so it's a very highly polymerized structure. We'll talk about what that word means in a bit. The other key for plagioclase is that this other stuff in here is sodium or calcium. Plagioclase is what we call a feldspar. So that's a subclass of silicate minerals that are framework silicates. So all the tetrahedra are connected to one another. And it's got a little bit of extra stuff in the structure. So like we saw, plagioclase has sodium and calcium. That's why sometimes you might also hear plagioclase referred to as sodium feldspar or Na feldspar, Na being the symbol for sodium, or it might be called calcium feldspar if it's the calcium-rich end member, or Ca feldspar or Ca spar Orthoclase, our next silicate mineral, is also a feldspar. So this pink colored mineral here is a feldspar, which means it's going to be a network silicate with a little bit of extra stuff in it. And we can see that the other name that often gets used for orthoclase is K feldspar or K spar. K stands for potassium. So you might also hear it called potassium feldspar. So you can guess that instead of being sodium and calcium in here, it's mostly potassium in orthoclase as being that extra stuff. Here's the crystal structure of orthoclase. Looks very similar to plagioclase, except that I've colored these other atoms a little bit different. So this purple is for potassium in here. You can see that structure looks pretty similar. All the tetrahedra are joined in a network. That's why it's a feldspar. And there's other stuff in here. That's the second reason that we call it a feldspar. Orthoclase is also light colored, but all of the samples of orthoclase that we're going to look at are going to be this pink color, somewhere between light pink and salmon pink. Orthoclase also has a non-metallic vitreous luster. So if you pick it up, you catch the light, you will see that this cleavage face reflects light all at the same time, much like a pane of glasswood. It doesn't look like a metal, which is why we call it non-metallic. But the way that it reflects light like a pane of glass means we'll call it vitreous. This piece has particularly well-developed cleavage faces. We can see that there's two sets, the top and bottom, and the left and right, and they meet at good 90-degree angles, making this piece with a rectangular shaped profile, and in some cases a square shaped profile. It's going to be a hard mineral, so hardness of 6, just like plagioclase, scratches glass, doesn't scratch quartz. It's got one other property that's useful. It's these things called X-solution lamellae. So if we take a closer look at this piece, we see these sort of white, scratchy, streaky looking lines that are internal to the mineral. Those aren't scratches on the surface. Those are actually places where just a little bit of white plagioclase feldspar is separating from the overall pink orthoclase feldspar. What's happening is that there's a little bit of sodium in that structure, and as the mineral cools, that sodium tends to separate out into a different mineral phase, leaving just small pieces oriented in the direction that you see of plagioclase mixed into the orthoclase. Because it's exsolving, it's separating out of solution with potassium, it's called X-solution lamellae. Lamellae just being those linear features. Quartz is the last silicate mineral we're going to look at. It can be many different colors, so I give you a sense here looking at these two different samples that they look very different. This one's been rounded by a stream too, which is why it doesn't look rough like this piece. But you can see that the colors on these pieces are very different. Quartz just needs a little bit of extra stuff to stain it a little bit, so that's why it can take on so many different colors. Color is not a very good diagnostic property for quartz. Now, how can you tell this apart from the feldspars? One way is that pieces of quartz fracture. They don't have cleavage, so they don't break with nice, even faces. Instead, they have fracture. Take a look at this piece here and rotate it around, and you don't see any consistent face in any direction. It's all pretty rough. Sometimes that fracture is what we call conchoidal fracture, which is this sort of circular fracture pattern. I'll show you what I mean here. Here is a good picture of conchoidal fracture. So you can see these fracture faces here. They're not flat, they're somewhat curved. And in addition, you see these curved lines that run along the surface. You see several of those conchoidal fracture faces here that are all meeting on this one mineral piece. So this is what conchoidal fracture looks like. Sometimes you see it, sometimes you don't. Quartz is also non-metallic, so it has a vitreous luster, much like the other silicate minerals that we've looked at. Although it doesn't all reflect at once, the piece of quartz itself will look a lot like glass in the way that it sparkles, not like a metal. And lastly, it is hard. So it's harder than the other silicates except for olivine, which also has a hardness of 7, which means that quartz will scratch all of those other minerals. Quartz will scratch feldspar. So that's another way that you can tell a big piece of it apart from pieces of other things. Here is the crystal structure of quartz. Once again, silicon in silver and oxygen in red. But the key difference here is that you don't see any other colored atoms. There's nothing else in this structure. That's because, apart from very minor impurities, quartz is going to be only silicon and oxygen. As a result, quartz, although it is a network silicate or a framework silicate, we don't call it a feldspar. So we can see, and you can confirm for yourself, that each of these tetrahedra are connected to 4 others, which makes it a framework or a network silicate, but it doesn't have any additional material in there. There's no sodium or calcium or potassium or any other metal ions that substitute to any great degree in quartz. So its composition is only silicon and oxygen. So just to review, that's the last of the silicate minerals that we're going to look at. We looked at 8 of them, and we've got olivine, augite, which is a type of pyroxene, hornblende, which is a type of amphibole, this guy, biotite, which is a type of mica, muscovite, this little thin clear piece, which is also a type of mica, plagioclase, a feldspar, orthoclase or potassium feldspar, and quartz. We talked about how they all have silica tetrahedra in them, SiO4, but we also noted that each of them have the silica tetrahedra connected in a slightly different way. So they were isolated in olivine, they formed single chains and double chains in augite and hornblende, they formed sheets in biotite and muscovite, and then they formed networks where each was bonded to 4 others in the feldspars and in quartz. That polymerization is going to come up later in the course, so I want to point it out now. And also coming up later in the course is the presence of magnesium and iron. So some of these minerals have magnesium and iron in them, notably the top 4. You'll note that those are all dark or green looking. That magnesium and iron imparts a dark color on these. That's going to be important when we're talking about, especially about igneous rocks. So keep that in mind. So those are different ways that we can separate the silicates into slightly different minerals, going from least polymerized to most polymerized, and also going from the most magnesium and iron to the least.